And as a region, there is no existing regional human rights mechanism in Asia. But in a smaller part of Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, there is this regional grouping called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. And ASEAN has been developing sub-regional human rights mechanisms. Now, ASEAN is only composed of 10 countries in Southeast Asia. And these countries are Cambodia, Brunei, Indonesia, Laos People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam.
Very well. Which are the evolving priorities of ASEAN in the region?
When ASEAN was established way back in August 8, 1967, its primary concern was to address security issues within the region. Now it has evolved into addressing economic issues, especially when it has renewed its existence in the form of having its own charter just way back in 2007, so quite recently. And part of having its own charter is also identifying human rights as a matter of concern within this sub-region of Asia.
And which are the human rights mechanisms developed in the context of ASEAN?
Right now, there are two sub-regional human rights mechanisms of ASEAN. We have the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. It is composed of 10 representatives of each ASEAN member state. While there is also an ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children, there are 2 representatives per ASEAN member state. One would represent the rights of women, the other one would represent the rights of children.
And are these representatives independent experts?
No, they are government representatives. So they are there to represent their respective member state.
Okay. And how many cases or matters have they studied since they started working?
Unfortunately, both sub-regional human rights mechanisms do not have a complaints mechanism. So they don't look into specific cases or violations of human rights by the member states. So right now, more of their functions are geared towards promotion of human rights, and in particular women and children's rights. So there are opportunities for protective mechanisms, but unfortunately these have not yet been thoroughly accessed by both human rights institutions.
And which are the main human rights issues currently being addressed by the mechanisms at the promotional level, or providing advice to member states?
Until recently, the most common issues or the most comfortable issues for ASEAN are women and children's issues, simply because when you talk about international human rights treaties, only the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women have been commonly ratified by the 10 ASEAN member states. Aside from this, since there has also been a surge of migrant workers coming from the region, this particular issue has also been of particular interest for the ASEAN member states. It is worthy to point out, though, that in the year 2012, ASEAN came up with its own ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, but it has yet to implement fully what they have declared in this ASEAN Human Rights Declaration.
Which are the rights that are contemplated in the declaration?
Well, the rights contemplated in the Declaration are similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It comprises civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. I think the only advantage here is that in ASEAN there has been no common ratification of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. No common ratification as well for the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So the importance of having an ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is that this is a political statement by the member states that they are ready to adhere and be bound by these rights. Of course, coupled with the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is the fear also of some NGO workers, civil society groups, and even by the international community that it seems that the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is trying to also water down some of international human rights standards on human rights. Particularly, there's a provision in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration that the rights must also be balanced with duties. Now, since the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is also a political declaration, when the heads of state of ASEAN adopted this Human Rights Declaration, they came up with a statement adopting it, but saying that in the implementation of the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, it must not go lower than international human rights standards, and enumerating instruments such as the UDHR, the Vienna Declaration, Program of Action, and also other international human rights treaties which ASEAN member states are parties to.
Is there a reasonable chance that the member states of ASEAN will discuss the possibility of adopting a regional treaty for the protection of human rights, a regional convention?
Yes, that's the general idea. In fact, in the mandate of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, they were mandated to come up precisely with this ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. And this would start the framework of a more binding instruments on human rights. So this is a possibility that hopefully would also happen sooner, but at the same time, with that hope is the hope that the binding instrument would also not water down international human rights standards, because it's going to be more than just a political statement this time. It's going to be a legal document under international law.
Indeed. So, in light of all of this, which are the main challenges faced by ASEAN and the human rights mechanisms in particular at institutional level?
Right now, the main challenge for both human rights mechanisms is, number one, the independence of the members or the representatives. As I mentioned earlier, the representatives for both mechanisms are appointed by their respective governments to represent the ASEAN member states. And although in their respective terms of reference it says that each of the representative must act impartially, there is also a counter provision saying that these representatives can actually be replaced anytime by the member states, that despite them having a certain term. So that independence is a critical factor, especially in trying to pursue probable human rights violations of particular member states. So having an independent expert as members is very critical in order to further add to the credibility and legitimacy of these two ASEAN human rights mechanisms. The second is that there are no complaints mechanisms in ASEAN. So in a way, you have a mechanism that is there but is not able to respond to probable needs of the people whose rights are violated within the ASEAN region. So this is also a critical factor which hopefully the ASEAN member states would look into in order to develop this particular ASEAN human rights mechanisms similar to human rights mechanisms that can be found in other parts of the world.
Very interesting. And which are the main challenges, but from the substantive historical point of view at the moment? What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't really say it's a substantial challenge in the sense that one of the key principles of ASEAN is its deciding by consensus. And it is also seen as one of the stumbling blocks why it's quite difficult to make a headway on improving the two ASEAN human rights mechanisms and also in addressing human rights issues that may be relevant to the region as a whole, but might be quite sensitive for particular ASEAN member states. So in that sense, if there is a particular issue that must be addressed from a regional level, but a particular ASEAN member state feels that it is against their national interest, then they have in a way sort of a veto power because ASEAN could only decide by consensus. So this is one major stumbling block being seen. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, if one way to address this is that if the ASEAN member states appoint independent experts instead of their representatives in the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and in the ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children, then this consensus could be addressed at least by independent experts' consensus on the matters, not from a political perspective of the member states' interests.
Now, from your Southeast Asian perspective, you're from the Philippines, do you think that there is a chance that all the states in the region outside Southeast Asia, but the broader region of Asia, could they somehow be persuaded to participate in this mechanism in the future, or create a parallel one that is somehow bonded to ASEAN?
That's a possibility. There is no regional grouping or aggregation for the whole of Asia. There are only two right now, sub-regional. So I mentioned about ASEAN, and in South Asia you have SAARC. But one of the driving factors of ASEAN is that it wants to play a central role in matters within the region. So it goes beyond only Southeast Asia. In fact, there is an East Asia summit back-to-back with the ASEAN summit. And this is driven by ASEAN. So in that matter, the East Asia summit involves countries outside Southeast Asia. So if such initiative actually progresses, then I see that yes, regional human rights mechanism can actually be expanded for a greater portion of Asia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here, and you're welcome. My pleasure.